So let's bring in our first guest, Warren Hogan, independent economist and a consultant to the small business lender Judo Bank. Warren, thanks for joining us. Let's start with US inflation. How high can inflation go over there?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ed. I think we're going to see US inflation reach a peak, a high, in the next couple of months. The reality is that it is already extraordinarily high by any contemporary standard at 8%. It's obviously a big component of it is food and energy, but even excluding those components, core inflation in the US is running at 6.4%, we found out last night. And the trim mean measure, which is our preferred measure of core inflation here in Australia, that's at 5.4%. So it's a broad-based inflation. It's high. The question really in relation to the energy and general commodity price shock emanating from the war in Europe is that it'll slow down the pace with which US inflation can fall over the course of the next 12 months. And of course, this is going to be of great concern to the US Fed because they were banking on inflation coming down pretty quickly and taking pressure off wages and that source of ongoing inflation.
Well, the US Fed meets next week and they're expected to lift rates 0.25%. But is there a chance the Chairman Jerome Powell could even hike rates more than that now?
Look, I think they were seriously considering a 50 basis point hike prior to what's happening in Europe. The initial feeling is that the uncertainty around the economy and financial markets that this conflict is generating would see them back away from it, although they have all but signaled they'll go 25. But the reality of the inflation picture being painted by these figures that we received last night and what's happening in actual commodity markets and energy markets is the case for a 50 is quite strong. So I think that is the big surprise. I don't think there's much chance they will not do anything. And of course, we're going to see a lot of associated commentary. We're going to get new forecasts. We're going to get a statement and a press conference. And I think the most likely scenario is that if they feel they need to send a strong message, rather than going 50, they'll send that message via the forecast, the dot plot, and the press conference.
Okay, let's shift to Australia now, where petrol prices about $2.20 a litre for unleaded, record highs. We'll get the inflation numbers for our first quarter just after Anzac Day. But what's your prediction for inflation in Australia and the implications for Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe with interest rates?
Yeah, unfortunately, Australia is the only G20 country in the world that has a quarterly CPI. And right now, I would suggest we need a monthly one. But putting that gripe as an economist to the side, I think we're going to get a big number in Q1, and that's not really because of what's happening in the Ukraine and in global energy and commodity markets. That was essentially, we're going to see this global inflation start to show up here. There was some signs of it coming through. So I think we're going to see headline inflation up around 4% and core inflation heading above 3%. In terms of the underlying trend very, very quickly. And I think it's going to, the inflation picture here in Australia is going to look a lot more like what we're seeing overseas than what we've been seeing in the past over the course of the next few months. And that'll be of some real concern to the RBA. And I think we're at a turning point. We've seen this week a real change in tone from the governor with his speeches. He's done 2 of them. And I think the window for a rate hike here in Australia opens after that CPI, starting in May. That, of course, will be complicated by a federal election campaign.
And the RBA is obviously dealing with a shake-up in the executive ranks. Deputy Governor Guy Debelle moving on to Fortescue Future Industries. Where does this leave the RBA and its succession planning process?
Well, it's a real shock. It's a real disappointment for the RBA and monetary policy in Australia. Guy Debelle is a standout economist. He's been trained and developed at the RBA for 25 years, and although it's his prerogative to move on, it's a rare thing for policymakers at this stage of their career to do that. And I think the timing is reflective of the fact that we've not only got an election campaign, and they might want to make some decisions quickly, but also, of course, where the monetary policy story here is changing. You know, it's been 30 years of cutting rates. Essentially, we've had a few
Warren Hogan, independent economist, consultant to small business lender Judo Bank. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ed.